The origins of this conflict lie in the post-World War I era. So I'll take you back to a couple of issues. Most of you are aware that most of the Arab Muslim world was colonized by European powers. Some of these lands became colonized later on. They were part of the Ottoman Empire. Palestine was part of the Ottoman Empire at the time of World War I. In the year 1918, this is when the British defeated the Ottoman Empire and took over the area of Palestine. And by the way, when we speak about the area of Palestine, we're talking about that piece of land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. This is the area that we have historically referred to as Palestine. And in fact, for 2,000 years, this is what human beings have referred to as Palestine. This particular land was a part of the Ottoman Empire. The British defeated the Ottomans in 1918. But 1 year before that, they made an agreement with the World Zionist Organization. This is not conspiracy theory, this is historical fact. They made an agreement with them, it's called the Balfour Declaration. Arthur Balfour was the Foreign Secretary of the British government. He made an agreement with the World Zionist Organization that Britain would endeavour to create a Jewish homeland in Palestine. And there are a couple of other clauses to that declaration. The next year, the British defeat the Ottomans and they take control over Palestine. From that point onwards, they facilitated the massive immigration of Jews from Europe into Palestine. Hundreds of thousands of Jews came. Now, while Palestine was under Ottoman rule, it's important to look at the population of that place. We see that most of the people were Muslim. About 80+% were Muslim. About 10 or 15% were Christian, and about 2 or 3% were Jewish. This was the population of Palestine at the time the British defeated the Ottomans. When Britain took over, they started bringing hundreds of thousands of Jews from Europe, which definitely upset the demographic balance. And this is where the origins of the Israel-Palestine conflict lie. The British themselves conducted commissions because the hostilities started right from the 1920s. There was, there was fighting, there was riots and this type of thing. And so the British conducted various commissions, the Shaw Commission, the Hope Simpson Commission, the Haycraft Commission. This is all historically documented to find out why is this hostility between the Jews and the Arabs going on in Palestine. And there were two answers they got from every commission that they put forth. And that is that the Palestinians were being driven off their land by these new Jewish settlers, and they were excluded from being able to work on that land. They were excluded from labour. These were the two reasons that every commission put forth. The being taken from their land being taken from them, and then being driven from their land and not being able to work there. These were the two reasons. So the origins of the conflict are very clear. The influx of massive Jewish immigration, hundreds of thousands of Jews from Europe, this is the start of the conflict. This situation went on for about a decade, and between 1936 and 1939, the Palestinians put up a major revolt against British occupation. And this was something that was happening in various parts of the Muslim world, because Palestine wasn't the only country under European colonization. Most of the Muslim world was under European colonial rule, whether it be the British, the French, the Italians, or so on. And the Palestinians, like other Muslims, tried to resist the colonial occupation. Between 1936 and 1939, they put up their strongest resistance. And in fact, they regained control over many parts of Palestine. But the British brought in about 100,000 troops to suppress this so-called revolt. And the British were able to take back Palestine. And one of the things they did was almost completely disarm the Palestinians of any weapons that they had. And of course, the weapons they had were quite simple. I mean, it was, World War I, rifles, this type of very simple things. But even these were stripped of the Palestinians. And so they were a very defenseless people coming into the 1940s. It's in the 1940s that the Jews then, these hundreds of thousands that had come into Palestine, that now made up about 30% of the population, from being 3% at the time of the Ottomans to now being about 30% of the population with their massive immigration from Europe. They now mounted their challenge against the British. And this is referred to in a very important book called The Gun and the Olive Branch. It's written by a British journalist. His name was David Hirst. He wrote this book back in 1977. And in that book, he describes what the Jews did as gun Zionism. He said this is the first terrorism that took place in the Middle East. He said it was the Jews who committed the first acts of terrorism in the Middle East. So there was bombings, there was sabotage, bombs in marketplaces, the lynching of people, all of the murder of people, all of this sort of thing was going on in Palestine. And so in 1947, they handed the so-called problem of Palestine over to the United Nations. The United Nations was only just newly formed. The previous international organisation was called the League of Nations, and so the United Nations was come after that. So the United Nations decided, they had formed various committees to decide how should we respond to this situation in Palestine, and they decided on a recommendation to partition Palestine. In fact, it required the United States to do a lot of underhanded lobbying and pressure and intimidation of a number of countries who were on the United Nations at that time to vote for that petition resolution, because the world overwhelmingly was opposed to the idea of petition. But the United States, and this is another historical fact, they intimidated many of the third world nations into accepting this petition resolution. So it was passed. It is known as General Assembly Resolution 181. General Assembly Resolution 181. And it recommended the partition of Palestine into a Jewish state and a Palestinian state. Now this is very important, because if you even visit the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs website or read any of the Zionist Israeli propaganda, you'll see they make a lot of discussion about this Resolution 181. The United Nations divided Palestine and they gave the Palestinians the chance to have their state, and they rejected it, so on and so forth. But you have to understand the details of this Resolution 181 in order to understand why this is complete nonsense and propaganda. Okay, the first thing is that this resolution said Palestine will be divided into two states, Jewish and Arab. 55% will be given to the Jewish state, 45% will be given to the Palestinian state. So right from the get-go, this is not fair, right? Let's look at it in a bit more detail. In this Jewish state, this 55%, all of the key infrastructure, we're talking about the port, which is in Haifa. We're talking about the airport, which was there. We're talking about the electricity sources. We're talking about the water sources, Lake Tiberias, for example, which feeds the Jordan River. All of these key infrastructural points would lie within the Jewish state, within this 55%. And then the rest, the less significant areas, the most fertile land was to be in the Jewish state. The secondary land, the least fertile, the land with the least infrastructural development, the 45%, this was going to go to the Palestinian people. But it gets worse. Not only is the distribution unfair and the quality of land they're getting unfair, but when we look at the situation, we'll see that the Jews at the time were only 30% of the population. In spite of the fact that hundreds of thousands of them had been brought in from Europe, they were still only 30% of the population. The Palestinians were 70% of the population. In spite of all of this Jewish immigration, they were still 70% of the population. Another very crucial point here is that the Jews only legally owned 6.6% of the land. They only legally owned 6.6% of the land. In that 55% that was to become their state, they only legally owned 11% of that land. Yeah? Those Jewish people had only been there, over 97% of them had only been there for the last 30 years. Okay? And the Palestinians had been there for millennia. Their fathers, their grandfathers, they are the indigenous, you talk about the indigenous people, we talk about that in this country, they are the indigenous people of Palestine. They had been there for generations and generations and generations. So they're 70% of the population. They had been there for millennia, and they legally own 93% of that land. And they're getting 45%. So why would they accept Resolution 181? Why would any people on this planet accept that resolution. Of course they rejected it. And of course the whole Arab world, the whole Muslim world rejected this. And much of the third world rejected this as well, because everybody could see how unfair that was. But the Israelis, they didn't come unprepared. They're thinking people, they came with a plan. Years before this Resolution 181, they had sent people into the various Palestinian villages all around Palestine to document certain things. What capabilities does the village have? How many men are there? Do they have any weapons? What crops do they grow? What other things do they produce? What things do they make? What do they manufacture? In other words, how viable is that village, right? What prospects does it have? And they documented this for the whole of Palestine. Now, this is not another conspiracy theory. This is well documented in a number of books written by Israeli historians. The most recent of which is written by an Israeli historian by the name of Ilan Pappy. Ilan Pappy wrote a book called The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. It was released in 2007. Any information you want about this is documented in his book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine by Ilan Pappy. So the Israelis had built up this very detailed catalogue of all Palestinian villages. And so after Resolution 181 was passed and rejected by the Palestinian people and the Arab world, the Jewish militias, the military and the paramilitary immediately went into action. They had been well trained. They had served with British forces in World War I. They had served with British forces in World War II. They had very good training. They had very good weaponry. And they had a lot of money coming in from Europe and from the United States especially. So they were very well equipped, very well trained, and very well armed. And so they were ready to take on the Palestinian people, who were really just largely a peasant population, completely disarmed from what the British had did to them in the 1930s. And so they began from 1947, from November 1947, the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. Now, a lot of people talk about, this war of 1948, the war of 1948 that supposedly started in May 1947 after Israel declared its state. May 1947, Israel declared the state of Israel, and then they said all of the Arab countries attacked us. But what they neglect to tell you is that the ethnic cleansing of Palestine began in November 1947, 6 months before any state of Israel was declared. As soon as that resolution was passed and it was rejected, and you understand now why it was rejected, they immediately went into action. First of all, the Israelis secured the 55% that was to be in their state, and they got rid of almost 90% of any Palestinians who were living in that first 55% that they wanted for their state. They ethnically cleansed. There were about 11 major towns or cities completely emptied of their Palestinian inhabitants. Can you imagine, like the Gold Coast, for example, completely emptied of its indigenous people? This is what they did. 11 major towns and cities completely emptied of their inhabitants, either killed or driven out. And at least 35 massacres took place. And this is not from Palestinian historians. Israeli historians documented 35 massacres that took place during this period. So you had hundreds of thousands of Palestinians driven from their homes and land just in this first 6 months alone. They estimate about 250,000, 250,000 driven from their homes and land just in this first 6 months alone. And then the process continued. So this ethnic cleansing continued for 6 months. In the end, about 800,000 Palestinians were driven from their homes and land. And so many more were murdered, so many women were raped. This is well documented by the historians. But 800,000 driven from their homes and land. When we talk about the Palestinian refugees, right, the right of return of Palestinian refugees, we're talking about the descendants of these 800,000 people that were driven from their homes and land. I'll come back to this issue of right of return, but one thing we should remember is, can you tell me one other international conflict where refugees haven't been able to return to their home and land? Always it's the case. It's just the international standard. When you have war and then you have some resolution, the people get to return to their homes and land, except in this case, except in the case of Palestine. 800,000 driven, from their homes and land and never to be returned. Now they number between 4 and 7 million people. We'll come back to that issue later. In May 1948, Israel declares the State of Israel. Okay, they declare their independence, they declare the State of Israel. Over 78% of historical Palestine. Now, if anyone who's been paying attention to what I've been saying knows that the UN only ever allocated 55%. How is it that they're declaring a state on 78% of historical Palestine? Basically, all of that territory between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, except the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. How do they declare a state over all of this area? How do they even come to possess anything more than that 55%? They did it through ethnic cleansing, and that's something the international community needs to answer for. Anyone who talks about, the right of Israel to exist and, recognition of Israel, in that is recognition of ethnic cleansing. So which Western government is prepared to do that? Because that's the reality. That is the only way they came to possess that extra 23%, not through the UN, through ethnic cleansing. So let's all keep that in mind. It's only after Israel declares its state that any Arab army enters Palestine. No Arab army entered before then. After this declaration, then you see the armies from Egypt, Syria, Jordan, also some from Lebanon, even some from Iraq come. But Israel is very well equipped, very powerful. In fact, numerically they had more troops than any of these Arab countries combined. Well, more troops than what the Arab countries were committing. Better weapons than what the Arab countries were committing. So after this so-called War of 1948, which ended about a year later, 1949, 1950, we see Israel in possession of 78% of historical Palestine. The Gaza Strip, the area known as the Gaza Strip, was under the control of Egypt, and the West Bank, including Jerusalem, including Al-Quds, was under the control of Jordan. And this is how the situation remained for the next, say, 20 years. Until 1967, Israel again goes to war with Jordan, Syria and Egypt. In this war, it captures the Gaza Strip and, in fact, the Sinai Peninsula as well from Egypt. It captures the West Bank, including Jerusalem, from the Jordanians, and it captures the Golan Heights from Syria. So it comes into possession of all of this territory. But one more thing that we should understand about this conflict is that there are a number of layers that have been built on. Now, I mentioned about the original problem, the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people. 800,000 driven from their homes and land, so many massacres and so on. The property that the Israelis came to possess. Because when they drove the Palestinians from their land, from their homes, they captured all of their fruit groves, their olive trees, their citrus trees. They took their houses and they went and lived in their houses, and they brought more Jews from Europe and different parts of the world and put them in those houses, Palestinian houses. They just took over complete villages. That's the ones that they didn't raze to the ground. And anyone I should have given some background about myself. My PhD thesis is on the Israel-Palestine conflict, and I went there in 2006, and that's where I did my field research. And there are some places in Israel where they built these, beautiful, forests, because they're so environmentally friendly, so they build these wonderful forests. Those forests that they've built are built over Palestinian villages that have been razed to the ground, and all the people in those villages were massacred. That's where they built those parks and forests. Okay? So if you ever go there, look very closely at the ground, and in some places you'll actually see the foundations of people's homes, and they built forests over that to try and disguise the ethnic cleansing that took place. You can see it for yourself. Don't have to go far, go to Jerusalem and just go to the areas just around Jerusalem and you can see it for yourself. Okay, now coming back to this issue. 1967, Israel takes control of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, and they've continued a military occupation there, and I mentioned about multi-layers. Today, it begins with the ethnic cleansing, and then you've got this military occupation that's been going on for now over 40 years. But you can add to that, within the West Bank, there's 500 plus checkpoints. Palestinians cannot go from one town to another without going through numerous Israeli checkpoints. Just to give you an example, the trip from here to Brisbane is about 40 minutes, right? Well, I live in Underwood, which is near Logan, about 40 minutes, nothing more than that. That's like going from Ramallah in the West Bank to Nablus, which is in basically the centre of the West Bank. And you can, if you're lucky, you can go from Ramallah to Nablus in about an hour. And I've made that journey. To leave there, you line up for at least 2 hours. This is on a good day. Usually people have to bring an overnight bag because they close the checkpoint, you have to sleep there. But 2 hours, you line up, men, women and children, babies crying, hungry, suffering, people needing to go to work, people needing to go to school, so on and so forth. The Israeli military at these checkpoints, they don't care. They point guns on people, harass people, treat people like animals. You line up for 2 hours and eventually you get through that checkpoint to get out of Nablus. Then you have to hop into a little taxi or little small bus. And then you drive for how long? 5 minutes. Another checkpoint. Everybody out. Check the whole car. One guy with me had fruit. He was a fruiter. And so he had boxes of fruit that he wanted to send, to the next town. Every box has to be checked because there might be something in there, whatever, all of this nonsense. So that journey, basically going from here to Logan, right, 40 minutes, 5 hours. How can any society function like that? I met people, and for us Muslims, family is very important. You visit your parents and your relatives constantly. I met people in places like Ramallah who had never seen their own mother, for more than 6 months, and she only lives 40 minutes away. Never seen their mother for 6 months because the journey is too hazardous because of these checkpoints. People can't get to school. People can't get to their jobs. How can an economy function? How can goods be delivered when you've got this sort of situation, these blockades? Even the World Bank has acknowledged that the biggest problem facing the Palestinian economy is Israel, and specifically these Israeli checkpoints. So this is another layer. Then you've got the closures and curfews. Whole towns are just simply closed. That's it. No one goes in, no one goes out. No one goes out of their houses. No one goes into the streets. The Israeli military patrol the streets. You can't do anything. You have to stay home. And this could last for a couple of hours or a few days or a few weeks. Just depends. This is another layer on the whole thing. Then you've got the wall. This wall that's going around the West Bank. This is not on the so-called Green Line, the armistice line of 1949 or, whatever, the 67 line, whatever you want to call it. The length of the wall is double the length of the border. How is that? How can the length of the wall be double the length of the border? It's because it cuts deep into the West Bank. And because you've got all these Israeli settlements, you've got hundreds of Israeli settlements, you've got almost 500,000 Israeli settlers living in the West Bank, supposedly Palestinian land. And this wall cuts inside to annex those settlements, to make them part of Israel, to include them as part of Israel. So the wall is twice as long as the border itself. Okay, and anyone who can say that this is for security and not for a land grab is speaking complete nonsense. And people are then cut off from their villages. People who are farmers have now a wall between their house and their land that they're meant to be tending, between their houses and their fruit groves or their citrus trees or whatever, olive grove. They can't even reach their land to water it because of this wall. So this is another layer.